OK. Thank you very much indeed. That's Sir David King. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you, Rita.
Well, the Prime Minister is due to announce new lockdown measures in England. We're waiting for a briefing from Downing Street, but for the moment, let's recap on what we know so far. So the BBC understands the Prime Minister will announce a month-long national lockdown in England. Non-essential retail and hospitality will be forced to close. Schools and universities will be allowed to stay open. Well, we can speak now to Dr. Chris Smith, who's a virologist at the University of Cambridge, and he joins me now. Good afternoon to you, Chris.
Good afternoon.
Do you think this was inevitable, given the data that we've had?
Well, I've been watching what's been happening with other countries across Europe, because if you cast your mind back to March and April, they were ahead of the curve on us in terms of numbers then, just as now. And we've been watching what's been happening in France, in Germany. We saw Belgium become embarrassingly somewhat for the EU, where their headquarters, of course, the country with the highest per capita rates of coronavirus across the entire world. So really, it was only a matter of time before we saw ourselves following down a similar path again. It's a symptom of the season. The weather has got colder. We've had this return to work, return of schools, return of universities, the cold weather closing in. All of those factors come together and they make the transmission of virus cases much more likely. And if you increase the likelihood and you increase contact between people, you get more cases. And when you get more cases, of course, you then end up, unfortunately, with more people trickling into hospital. And then ultimately, if you're not careful, you end up with a rush into hospital. And that's what they're trying to avoid.
We were hearing yesterday that the increase in cases in Europe has been attributed to an outbreak in Spain from a new strain of the virus. Is there any indication that that's happened here?
Well, people are watching this very closely. The coronavirus, unlike other viruses that cause seasonal outbreaks, of course, the flu is the one we're most familiar with. Coronaviruses change only very slowly. In fact, people have been monitoring the rate at which this new coronavirus has mutated or evolved ever since the outbreak began back in January in China. And it changes only very slowly. Out of a genetic code of about 30,000 genetic letters, it's made only about 2 changes per month across the entire 30,000 letters of its genetic code. So that's a pretty slow rate of mutation. But that said, we have seen some changes that do appear to crop up more commonly than you would expect at random. And so the virus is definitely evolving, as all viruses do, but it's very early to say that one particular strain is going to dominate or do one particular thing. So I don't think that we're expecting a sudden shift in the virus in that respect, but it's certainly something people are monitoring, because all viruses mutate, all viruses evolve, and this one's no exception.
How interesting. So what does that mean in the race to find a vaccine?
Well, fortunately, most scientists agree that the changes that we have seen to the virus so far, notwithstanding the fact that they've been small and it's not changing very fast, they haven't affected the antigenicity of the virus. They haven't affected its appearance to the immune system very much. So what that means is that the way in which we'll vaccinate against it, and assuming that the vaccine candidates that are out there, they're in phase 3 trials now, there are quite a few of them, which gives us reason to be optimistic we're going to get a vaccine. It doesn't appear that changes in the appearance of the virus would in any way undermine the effectiveness of those vaccines at this stage. That does happen with other viruses, but this one, it's happening, it's changing only so slowly that we don't think it will make a very big difference to the way in which a vaccine will protect a person, at least not at this stage.
I wonder if I can just bring you back to the announcement that we are expecting of a national lockdown in England. Does this make sense for those areas of England where the prevalence of the virus is low?
Well, this was the argument originally set out by the Prime Minister when the tier system was unveiled a few weeks ago, when this question was put to him: why is it that you've got other countries that are ushering in a new lockdown, and here in the UK we're not? I think Robert Peston put the point to him, saying the numbers that we're seeing today are equivalent to the numbers that we reported back in March and April when the country went into a lockdown. Why is this time any different? And the argument put forward was that, unlike back in March and April, the distribution of cases was very patchy. Now we've got some hotspots and some areas that are much lower, and therefore it didn't make sense to, in the Prime Minister's words, close down Cornwall to prevent an outbreak in Manchester. But what is actually similar to March and April is that the rate of change across the country is high everywhere, even though the overall number of cases is now lower. So I think what may have tipped the balance is that anticipating where this will lead in a few weeks' time, and with an eye on Christmas as well, and hopefully saving the Christmas season, it makes sense to act now more universally perhaps than it did, although I know that in most people's minds they would prefer not to be having to go down this path. None of us would.
Very good to talk to you. Thank you so much. As always,
Pleasure. Thank you.
Chris Smith, virologist at the University of Cambridge. Thank you. Well, you're watching BBC News. We are waiting for a press briefing from Downing Street on a prime ministerial announcement. We are expecting an announcement that England is to go into lockdown for a month. That press conference has been delayed. We were expecting it earlier in the afternoon. We were expecting it at 5 o'clock. We are told that there is a delay to it. We are, of course, watching things very closely in Downing Street. And as soon as we see any sign of movement there, we will be going straight over there. But for the time being, we're joined by Professor Neil Ferguson, an epidemiologist at Imperial College London, who in March predicted that up to 500,000 Britons could die from COVID-19, which led to the government enforcing a nationwide lockdown. Good afternoon to you, Professor Ferguson. Thanks so much for joining us. So your modelling led to the original lockdown. What's your reaction to the fact that we seem to be heading now for a second national lockdown?
Yes, I mean, our modelling also at that time suggested that we might have to go into lockdown more than once, that if we relaxed measures that transmission would resurge. And unfortunately, that's what we've seen this autumn, with schools reopening, with shops reopening. And whilst the tier 3, tier 2 measures are having some effect at slowing spread, it doesn't seem to be enough. And therefore, if we want to get what are now very high infection levels down, we need to impose more measures, particularly ahead of Christmas.
So should this have been done earlier? Because we know that the Scientific Advisory Group was talking from September the 21st about locking down earlier.
I think it's a difficult set of questions because there is an economic impact to all of these measures, and businesses are already suffering. I think there was a justifiable reason to wait a little to see whether the tiered measures being introduced would have sufficient effect to control infection levels. It doesn't appear to be the case that that's the effect, that whilst they're slowing infection, they're not causing case numbers to drop, which is what we really need at the moment.
So you think it was understandable and justifiable for the government to try the tiered, localised measures first?
I understand the political reasons for doing so. I mean, we are epidemiologists. We study disease trends. We suggest things which might bring infection levels down. But at the end of the day, there's a balancing act between introducing measures which we think will work effectively, but at huge cost, and balancing the impacts on the economy.
So we learnt yesterday that on October the 8th, the Scientific Advisory Group was saying that the projection now exceeded their worst case scenario. So that was 3 weeks ago. Should the government have acted sooner?
I think there have been a lot of discussions in government, and obviously we've seen areas being escalated. And of course, we're only talking about back in 2-3 weeks ago with the introduction of the tiered system, which it would hope, the government hoped would bring infections under control. I mean, there was always some question as to whether tier 3 measures were sufficient in those hotspot areas to slow in and to reverse infection levels. That has proved not to be the case.
I don't know if it's possible for you to answer this, but can you quantify what difference it would have made if a lockdown had been brought in earlier?
We can quantify, yes, but I think there's an important consideration here that all a lockdown does is reduce infection levels for the period of time it's in force. So if we think about where we're going to end up on Christmas Eve, whether we have a lockdown on, let's say, beginning of October or the beginning of November, and it only lasts for a month, you actually end up back in the same place as you would have done in that end of December timeframe. I mean, lockdowns are effective when they're in force. they reverse infections by a certain amount, but then once you release them, infection levels we predict start going up again. So I think the really important question is what's going to follow this lockdown? What set of measures are we going to put in place which allow some more economic activity but don't allow virus levels to spike as we approach Christmas?
So if those measures are put in place, is 4 weeks, in your opinion, sufficient?
It is very difficult to say at the current time. The measures which are being considered are basically similar to March, with the big exception that schools and universities are open. And so back in March, we got to a stage where infection levels were roughly halving every week, a little bit more than that. We're unlikely to reach, during lockdown, we're unlikely to reach that level of decrease now, but over a 4-week period, we could see a decrease anywhere from 20% to 80%, and it's very difficult at the moment, without actually living through it and recording the data, to understand where we'll end up at the end of it. So that's a question which lots of scientists will be trying to address in the coming weeks, but can't be answered now.
But I noticed that you did mention, you did reference Christmas. Might people be able to hope for a Christmas that is nearly normal?
I very much hope so. I mean, personally as well. I think it won't be fully normal, but I think we would all like to be in a position where we can allow larger groups of people to mingle, to come together for the celebration, if only for a few days.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. That's Professor Neil Ferguson from Imperial College London. Thank you so much. Well, we can speak now to Kevin Courtney, who's in East London, and he is the General Secretary of the National Education Union. Good afternoon to you, Kevin. We've heard a little earlier from our education editor, Branwen Jeffries, that you are calling for schools to be closed in the event of a national lockdown in England. We are expecting a national lockdown. Why do you want that to happen?
Well, if the Prime Minister calls for a national lockdown of around 4 weeks, that's what we're hearing, we don't think it should be a half measure. To have the maximum effect, we think schools should be part of that closure. We've been looking at data from the Office for National Statistics, which shows that the biggest growth rate is among secondary school pupils, where according to the ONS, our analysis of the ONS figures, cases have increased 50 times since September, far higher than any other age group. And so to get the maximum effect of the lockdown, it would be sensible to include schools in it. We all want children to be at school, but we also know that if we just take half measure after half measure, we end up with bigger and more serious lockdowns. So we think the government should include schools in this period of lockdown. That takes us back to March. We think schools should be open for vulnerable children and children of key workers. It takes us back to March and we get the cases falling, and we hope the government then uses that time to dramatically improve test, track, trace. We also think that at the end of that secondary schools at least should be on a rota basis. Children in school learning physically 1 week, at home, following their lessons at home the second week. So teachers in school the whole time and support staff, teachers and support staff in school the whole time, but children at home half the time. We think that according to SAGE, that could have an effect of depressing the virus as big as closing the whole of hospitality. So we think that is a sensible measure, a balanced measure for the government to look at.
But we certainly heard during the first lockdown in the spring that there was a very variable pattern of schools providing work for pupils. So pupils were off school for 5 months. Some of them were well catered for and some of them very much were not.
Absolutely. We think that we've learnt a lot. We know there are sixth form colleges currently running on a rota basis where year 12 is in 1 week, year 13 in the next. The teacher teaches their year 12 class physically in the room, then they go to the room that year 13 are in and they teach their class remotely. So year 13 is then taught every lesson And so that seems to be working in sixth form colleges. There's that model, and there's another model where half the alphabet are in. So half the class are physically taught, and the other half are watching remotely and being engaged with remotely, and the children swap over time by time. That seems to be working in sixth form colleges, where we're aware of that working. Children registering every morning as normal, and there is, from doing that, an impact on the R rate. According to SAGE's estimates, that's as big as closing the whole of hospitality, if it's secondary schools, it doesn't have a big impact on the economy. Lots of secondary children could be at home on their own without their parents being there. So we're calling for all schools to be in the national lockdown to avoid another half measure, which will just need to be repeated. So have schools in this lockdown now. Use that as time to get test, track, trace running properly and to organise rotas in secondary schools. We think that could be a good contribution to making sure that children are still learning, but that schools can be a contribution to suppressing the virus.
But are you drawing a distinction between primary schools and secondary schools? Because the evidence suggests that young children do not suffer badly from the virus by and large and are not great transmitters of it.
We're certainly not drawing a distinction between primary and secondary schools in terms of what we're saying about this 4-week lockdown period. We think that the government should not resort to half measures. It should close everything down to try and get the cases down. But that's for a defined period.
Why? Sorry to interrupt, but why? If young children, if primary school children are less likely to get ill, less likely to transmit, why should they not go to school?
Well, the data from the ONS suggests that 1% of primary children are carrying the virus. 2% in secondary school children, and secondary school children, the rate there is going to exceed university students. It looks like by the end of next week. So these are high rates, and we're not talking here about threats to the children, because even children in secondary school, according to all of our understandings, are not badly affected
I'm
by
going
the
to
virus.
sell my PlayStation, that's why I'll be able to get a new cable and mouse because I need one. So
we're looking at the ONS data. We're saying that the people who are 25 years, 30 years older than secondary pupils, their parents, that the rates are higher there. And we suspect that's coming from secondary pupils. This 50 times increase in the rate in secondary pupils since September should be alarming, I think, to all of us. And we have to find a way of educating children while not having the rates growing at such a rate. If we got to a place where we could have rotas, then half the children wouldn't be travelling to school every week. The schools would have half the number of children in them, but the children would be being taught every lesson. And I think we think that's a sensible compromise position which gets children learning and suppresses the virus.
So you would then be catering for them educationally, but what about the society that they need, the community, the company? What about young people's mental health?
Well, I think that the 4-week closure is going to be difficult for everyone. And we know it's difficult for the economy. We know it's difficult all round. And that's why we're saying don't do a half measure, which means you just have to come back to it again. Better to suck it up. And like Jacinda Ardern said in New Zealand, go hard and go early. Our proposal on rotas for at the end of this lockdown period, we think would get over some of those mental health questions, which are very real because children would be in school half the time and they would be being taught all of the time. And we certainly think, I think Rishi Sunak should be interested in that because it's a measure which depresses the virus, we think, as much as closing the whole of hospitality, but may not have that degree of effect on the economy. So we think that's very worthwhile the government looking at and getting SAGE to look at that and model around that.
OK, very good to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Kevin Courtney, General Secretary of the National Education Union. Now, the Conservative MP Steve Baker has said that the Prime Minister has got very difficult choices to make over the next few days. Mr Baker was speaking outside Downing Street following a briefing with scientists.
Well, today what I've had is the opportunity to take a team into Downing Street. There were 3 scientists, myself, a data analyst. We've had an amazing opportunity to robustly scrutinise the arguments, the data, the forecasts of where we're going. And what I would say to people is the Prime Minister's got very, very difficult choices to make, and I would encourage all members of the public and all members of Parliament to listen extremely carefully to what the Prime Minister says today and over the coming days. I think my colleagues, like me, need to cast their minds forward several weeks and think what might happen to the NHS, but that won't make any sense to them until they've heard from the Prime Minister, until they've had some briefings. I'm expecting them to see some of the data that I've been looking at today. I'm expecting that to be shown to members of Parliament, and I hope they'll reflect very carefully on what it will mean for their constituents as we go forward.
Conservative MP Steve Baker there. Well, Chris Mason, our political correspondent, is back with me. Chris, we've been waiting for this press conference from Downing Street for quite a while. Any information?
Yeah, it was scheduled for 4 o'clock, then it was pushed back to 5 o'clock. We were then told it was from 5 o'clock, which hinted at the prospect of a minimal delay, perhaps. It's now looking like it'll be at around, I'm underlining around, 6:30. So it looks like within the next 40 minutes or so, but of course, given that delay has not exactly been unprecedented this afternoon, there is at least the scope that it might be delayed yet again. What are we going to hear from the Prime Minister? We're going to hear that from Thursday of this week until the 2nd of December, so almost a calendar month, there will be a lockdown across England, with non-essential shops closing. So that's most shops, supermarkets though remaining open. The hospitality sector being told to close, so restaurants, pubs and cafes, except those that can offer a takeaway service. People will only be able to meet one person outside from outside their household. But that's an important detail for the millions of people living alone, that they will be able to see people outside during this period of weeks, starting in a couple of days. And crucially, as you're reflecting on there in your conversation with Kevin Courtney, schools, colleges and universities remaining open, even though there are those within the teaching unions making an argument that they should close. I'll just bring you one detail, Rita, about the process via which we have found out what is happening, because those of us who've been watching our conversation over the last hour or so will have seen that the whole process has been delayed. They'll also be conscious that there's the oddity that we are talking about what the Prime Minister is going to announce before the Prime Minister actually announces it. And there are some who might reasonably ask, well, why didn't we hear that from the Prime Minister first? Well, it's the job of journalists to try and find out what's going on in government. That's why you'll have read things in the newspapers this morning that hinted at where we were going, and you'll have seen it being reported on the BBC as well. What I can tell you tonight is the Prime Minister has written to all Conservative MPs to reflect on their frustration at how this has been communicated, given that we are in a national crisis, and some might have hoped that the first you would have heard about this is from the Prime Minister rather than from others. I can just bring you some extracts from that email that was sent to Conservative MPs by Boris Johnson. He says, "Folks, so sorry that you've had to hear about all of this from the newspapers. Let me assure you that this was not a leak from a Number 10 briefing, and indeed we have launched an inquiry to try and catch the culprit." Leak inquiries, as you know, Rita, happen fairly often in Whitehall, and more often than not, they do not find the culprit. But it goes on to say that the Prime Minister tells MPs, his MPs, that he had hoped to make this announcement in Parliament on Monday, but given the reporting in the newspapers and elsewhere, he'll now be doing this news conference this evening, as he describes it. I guess 6:30 does count as this evening. He then says that Downing Street will be making all of the data available to Conservative MPs to try and talk them through what we will be shown in this news conference that is coming up in the next hour or so. And he is doing what he is doing, he says, in this memo to his colleagues, because we believe it is in the best interest of the country and to ensure that the NHS is not overwhelmed in a way that could cost many thousands of lives. There is a clear way out of this with better medication and rapid testing and the genuine prospect of a vaccine, he writes. Our country will recover well, but I am afraid there are no easy short-term options. And he signs it, Best Boris. So an insight there into the Prime Minister's thinking, an insight into how he is having to manage the frustration and the anger in some quarters on the Conservative backbenches. I'm conscious that all of that does sound like process rather than actually what really matters, but it's the process that leads to the outcome that the Prime Minister will announce, and offers you some explanation as to why we spent some of the day saying this news conference would happen at 4 o'clock, some of the day saying it would happen at 5 o'clock, and we're now saying it will probably happen at roughly 6:30.
And process is important, isn't it, Chris? Because if it's not handled properly, it may feed into a perception that the government is just not on top of this as it should be.
Yeah, and there has been frustration from supporters of the government on the Conservative backbenches who want to see the Prime Minister succeed. And you speak to the Labour Party, they say they want the Prime Minister to succeed in a national crisis. Why wouldn't they? But there's been frustration from Conservative backbenchers who are often sent out to defend the government line, that they will do that with gusto because they are loyal to the government. And if you're a Conservative MP, of course, that is your natural inclination, only to discover that there are briefings going on privately at the same time that lead the government to change its mind. Now, clearly, from the government's perspective, this is a rapidly changing situation with new data being presented every day. What has clearly changed minds in Downing Street in the last 24 hours, in a picture that was already looking increasingly bleak, and we knew that because ministers were articulating that concern, are two things. One is a series of projections from a range of scientific advisors, all of which were pointing, even when you build in the margins of error that these projections inevitably include, all of which were pointing towards a spike in cases which would be much higher and much sooner than what was known as the reasonable worst-case scenario that was the basis for the government's judgments over the last couple of weeks. Presented with that, alongside additional data that suggested that hospital capacity would very quickly be overwhelmed, even in areas of the country where the rates of the virus might be climbing rapidly but are currently quite low, has forced the government to take what it has been saying until, well, literally today, was the thing it wanted to avoid. It felt its regional approach was more sensible, got the balance right between lives, liberties and livelihoods. Presented with this data by scientists in the last 24 hours, they've been left with no option but to go for the nuclear option, the very thing they didn't want to do.
And Chris, just briefly, I've been talking to a string of experts this afternoon who say lockdown, fine, they welcome it, but they say that in itself is not enough. There has to be something else to their strategy. Yeah,
and there is always the concern that a lockdown doesn't solve anything. It merely delays things from happening. Now, clearly, if you are delaying the prospect of people getting the virus, delaying the prospect of some people ending up in hospital, and bluntly, postponing the potential that some people could die, and potentially postponing it to the point where you have medications or a vaccine that can prevent that from happening, clearly that's a strategy worth pursuing. But there will inevitably be questions in this news conference about what do you do at the end of this period, particularly given that in the spring there was talk of a lockdown lasting for a handful of weeks and it lasted much longer.
Chris, thank you very much indeed. And now it is time for a look at the weather with Alina Jenkins.
Hello, some turbulent weather across the UK this weekend with torrential rain and gales. Those strong winds really whipping up the waves, particularly across southern and western coasts. And for some western areas, we've seen in excess of 25 millimetres of rain in just 24 hours, well over an inch in places. For others, the rain has been clearing through the day, some spells of sunshine in places and some respite from the rain for a time, because there's more in the forecast as we head into Sunday, coupled with further gales. There's a number of Met Office yellow warnings in place, and you can find all the details on our website. Now, the wet and windy weather has come courtesy of this area of low pressure, Storm Aiden, pulling away northwards as we head through the night. But waiting in the wings is another area of low pressure and frontal system, which will be pushing further rain eastwards. Initially into Northern Ireland, then after something drier across the rest of the UK, more rain will push into western Scotland, the western side of England and parts of Wales, and then transfer its way eastwards as the night wears on. Still some gusty winds, not quite as strong as they have been in places, but they will start to strengthen again through tomorrow, particularly across the western side of Scotland. It's not a cold night. Temperatures not much lower than 7 or 8 Celsius across the northern half of the UK and 8 to 11 Celsius further south. On into Sunday, so we've got this area of low pressure to deal with. Notice on the southern flank how close the isobars are together, and that's going to bring some very strong winds across western Scotland. Still another wet and windy day for many. That rain soon out of the way from Northern Ireland will be clear from most through the morning, leaving some spells of sunshine, a scattering of showers before more rain starts to pile in from the west, likely to be most persistent across the northern half of England, into parts of Northern Ireland, Wales, the Midlands, and again some gusty winds, particularly for western coasts, and especially so across western Scotland, where they will likely exceed 70 miles an hour. Temperature-wise, 10 to 14 Celsius across the northern half of the UK and up to 17 Celsius further south. And we keep that rain going through tomorrow evening across the northern half of England, into the Midlands and Wales. Likely to see some flooding here, And again, we have those warnings in place from the Met Office. And the weekend weather continues into Monday for some. Still a wet, blustery, if not very windy day. And that rain slowly starts to ease on Tuesday, as do the winds. And then high pressure takes charge. So as we head through Wednesday and the latter half of the week, it looks drier, less windy, but will be colder, particularly overnight.
Boris Johnson is set to announce a second national lockdown for England. New restrictions are expected to last until December, with schools and universities exempt. The latest scientific advice shows the second wave is set to be more deadly than expected unless further measures are imposed.
It's really clear that if we don't take action now, we will see those hospitalisations and deaths go up in a concerning way in the next few weeks.
It comes as the total number of UK cases since the pandemic began passes 1 million. Also tonight.
Bond. James Bond.
Sir Sean Connery, the very first screen James Bond, has died at the age of 90. Good evening and welcome to the BBC News at 6. Boris Johnson is expected to announce that from Thursday there'll be a new month-long lockdown across England that will last until the 2nd of December. Sources have told the BBC that restaurants and pubs will close, but takeaways and deliveries will be allowed. All non-essential retail will also close, but supermarkets are to stay open. Households will not be allowed to mix inside except for childcare and other forms of support. Unlike the first lockdown, schools, colleges and universities would stay open, while travel will be discouraged except for work. Here's our political editor, Laura Kunsberg.
Misery, the Prime Minister's own prediction of what a return to lockdown would feel like. But the instruction on its way again for the country to close its doors, after warnings of a second deadly wave of the virus from the government's own scientists. We expect the Prime Minister tonight to urge people in England again to stay at home, to close bars and restaurants from Thursday for a month. But this time, schools, colleges and universities will be allowed to stay open alongside essential shops. It's the last thing the government wanted to do, but this is what confronted the Prime Minister yesterday. Projections from several groups of scientists seen by the BBC of the number of people who could die each day if nothing changes. They vary, and there are big margins of error, but one model even suggests a peak of well over 4,000 daily deaths. All of the projections are more serious than the current worst-case scenario, shown here in black, and potentially dwarf the first wave in spring, shown here in blue as a comparison. And there are fears of the implications of that for the entire health service. This separate document suggests that within 10 days, capacity in the English NHS will be full in some parts of the country. And as the weeks progress, even if the Nightingale hospitals are all reopened and non-urgent care cancelled, the NHS will not be able to accept any more patients by Christmas week. And because any extra measures would take time to make a difference to the disease, the window to act is now for the majority of the country. The Prime Minister can't say he wasn't warned. The opposition, some of his own ministers and some of his own advisers were pushing for a limited lockdown many weeks ago now. But he chose instead to hold out under pressure from the Treasury and Tory backbenchers, choosing instead to try to keep the disease at bay with a patchwork effect, different regulations in different parts of the country, an effort to try to guard the economy too. But that judgment now looks like it was a political accident waiting to happen. There was always a risk this could happen again, but that doesn't make the reality any less painful for the public or less politically problematic for a Prime Minister who has spent weeks resisting and now is set to tell England at least to once again live life behind closed doors.
And Laura's with me now. Laura, we're still waiting to hear from Boris Johnson, but from what we do know, this is a big change of heart from him.
It is, and we shouldn't make any bones about this. The Prime Minister has time and again shown how reluctant he was to make this decision. He's resisted this also time and again, despite calls from his political opponents and some of his own advisers. But he has been trying to balance for the last couple of months those calls to act more swiftly to get the brakes on the disease, with demands from business, from parts of his own party who've said, look, this isn't just about health, that's extremely important, but it's also about the impact of the economy, protecting people's jobs, and of course the impact to other services in the NHS that people rely on too. That's why he's been resisting a shutdown like this for so long. But we should also make clear, while there is a big sense of déjà vu, there are a couple of very important differences this time round. Schools, universities, colleges will stay open. That's a very different situation to March and April for millions of families. But the other very important difference is it's not at all clear that the other parts of the UK, the governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, will follow England's lead here. Now that could leave us in a very difficult situation as a country. Lots of complexities that there weren't in the difficulties of March, April and those early days of lockdown. But there is also no question tonight, and we'll see how Boris Johnson chooses to express it in his own words. The government clearly here does leave themselves very open to the accusations that people told them they wouldn't listen, and he's been dragged and forced to act in the end in a position where they just don't have a choice.
And Laura, how is this going to go down with the Prime Minister's backbenchers who have been resisting this?
Well, there's definitely been a lot of unhappiness. We've heard through the day privately from some politicians, including some very senior MPs, who are really unhappy at how this has been handled, really unhappy about how it's emerged. There's a sense that actually Downing Street doing it like this, the press conference even tonight, has been delayed. So there's unhappiness at the political handling of it. But I think that clearly the way the numbers are moving, those leaked documents that we've seen here at the BBC that show what the government now believes the disease could look like in just a matter of weeks if nothing is done, I think that may in the coming days change the balance of opinion over whether or not Boris Johnson really had a political choice. But don't forget there does have to be a vote this time. Back in early spring, the government just did this, they carried on, there was a huge degree of political consensus. It's a much scratchier, difficult atmosphere for the Prime Minister this time round.
Laura, thank you. Our political editor, Laura Kunsberg there. So what more do we know about the reasons for this move by the government? Our health correspondent, Catherine Da Costa, has been looking at the statistics.
Many still exhausted, some still traumatised. NHS staff know what's to come. They're better prepared than in the spring, with more PPE, treatments and better understanding of the virus. But this time, hospitals are trying to keep other services running while seeing rising numbers of COVID patients. In April, there were nearly 20,000 patients with coronavirus in hospital across the UK. That dropped over the summer, but numbers have climbed to nearly 11,000. And with hospital admissions currently doubling roughly every fortnight, hospital leaders are worried.
We've been saying, and we've been saying it for about 3 or 4 weeks, that it's really important the government moves quickly and does tough lockdowns as quickly as possible, because otherwise the NHS won't have the capacity it needs.
The latest estimates show even with the tougher Tier 3 restrictions in parts of England, the epidemic's still growing, with between 50 and 100,000 new infections a day. And it's rising rapidly in the south. Health officials warn more hospital admissions and deaths will follow. It's all part of the data that's prompted a national lockdown.
We know there's economic damage. We know there's damage to people's well-being and mental health of long-term lockdown. But some kind of short, maybe 3 to 4 week national strategy to bring incidence down, allow time for test and trace to get to where it needs to be. And hopefully that will enable us to maybe relax a little bit over the winter period, over the Christmas period, and protect the NHS.
Locking down now will bring the virus under control to get through the winter and buy some time to develop mass testing, new treatments and an effective vaccine. Catherine Da Costa, BBC News.
The latest government figures show that there were 21,915 new coronavirus infections recorded in the latest 24-hour period. There have now been more than 1 million cases of coronavirus in the UK. The average number of new cases reported per day in the last week is 22,522. And 326 deaths were reported. That's people who died within 28 days of a positive COVID-19 test. It means on average in the past week, 259 deaths were announced every day. And it takes the total number of deaths so far across the UK to 46,555. Well, our health editor Hugh Pym is here with me now. And Hugh, we've now had more than 1 million cases of coronavirus in the UK. That's a sobering figure.
Yes, Rita, and even more so when you think that's doubled in just a month. Looking back to the end of August, it was about 1,000 daily reported cases each day in the UK. It's now more than 20,000. That just shows you how things have escalated. It really seemed to start with people coming back from holidays, school pupils and students getting back to go to wherever their education was. And many people said that was likely to happen. And as we've been hearing, government advisors did say late in September that it was escalating beyond what they were expecting and that action was needed, and that debate will continue. So this lockdown in England will aim to suppress those cases and bring them down. And of course, there are a lot more than those ones that I've just mentioned, because they only include people who've gone to be tested. There are many more out there, according to surveys, who don't know they've got it and don't have symptoms. But of course, sadly, there are people who've already got the virus who will become infected so seriously they'll end up in hospital, and some of them tragically won't survive. We already know that. That will continue to happen even during this month, because that is what is there in the trajectories that all the experts have been talking about. So more than 200 deaths a day could well get to 500. So the hope is that it'll bring the virus down and allow the test and trace system to work more effectively, certainly in England, in the weeks after the lockdown, assuming it's being eased. But that's a big ask of a test and trace system that hasn't performed particularly efficiently in recent weeks. One thing I should say, hospital treatment of those with COVID-19 has become more effective as doctors have learnt more about the virus. More people are surviving, having gone into intensive care. But certainly the NHS is going to be very busy in the weeks ahead.
Thank you very much. Hugh Pym there. Now, the prospect of a new national lockdown comes on the final day of the Treasury's furlough scheme, which has subsidised the wages of up to 9.5 million employees. The less generous job support scheme replaces it, and business leaders are warning that much more financial help will be needed from the government in the months ahead. Our business correspondent Katie Austin reports.
Today was a big date in businesses' diaries because the furlough scheme is closing. This lighting firm will use its replacement, the Job Support Scheme. Aimed at keeping workers in their jobs on reduced hours, it's less generous. The government will pay 62% of hours they're not working and the employer 5%.
We used to have 85 staff working in the two warehouses. We think we've only got enough work for about 25, but JSS means that we can actually keep 45 staff on working part-time.
There's a different version for firms forced to close by law because of restrictions. For them, the government will fund 2/3 of workers' wages. These schemes and other extended support were announced before a new lockdown was on the cards.
My heart sunk because it's devastating news for business.
To get through it, the boss of one hotel group told me a further support package will be needed.
Grants need to be reviewed. The furlough scheme really needs to be back to where it was in March, where we're covering 80% of our staff's wages. We really need those VAT and business rate relief extended for hospitality to come out of this crisis and recover over the number of years it's going to take to repay all the debt.
It's unsettling news too for this London beauty salon.
We had just started to see the light at the end of the tunnel, and the fact that we may have to lock down and close for however long is a real concern to us. You know, we still have to pay rent. I wasn't given a rent period, a holiday period for rent.
The British Retail Consortium says no shop should have to close.
It would be a disaster for us all as customers in the lead up to Christmas if part of the retail industry were forced to close as part of today's announcement. £1.6 billion a week of retail sales were lost in April, May and June, and that would be an even bigger figure with the consequences for jobs.
Business groups are calling for more support. The question now is whether that will be forthcoming from the Chancellor and how it would be paid for. Katie Austin, BBC News.
Up until now, the government has been committed to its three-tier system. Bradford was due to go into the highest tier on Monday. Our correspondent Lakshmi Gopal is there for us now. Lakshmi.
Well, Rita, tighter restrictions are nothing new in this part of the country. In fact, today it's exactly 3 months since parts of West Yorkshire, including Bradford, were first put into a local lockdown, reflecting the high infection rates in this area. Bradford is in the top 20 in England, and its rates are continuing to rise. And from Monday, the 2.3 million people across West Yorkshire will be moved into Tier 3. And some businesses have told me that those restrictions could push their livelihoods to the brink, let alone this new prospect of an England-wide full lockdown. After months of uncertainty and different rules to get their heads around, business owners now face yet another change.
The more I think about it, it's like writing a novel without having any ending to it. You try your best to survive in what we have to do, what you have to do. Unfortunately, we have some very mixed guidelines, and this is where the real confusion is, because I don't think businesses know really what they have to do.
People in Bradford were preparing for Tier 3 measures on Monday. Now they're bracing themselves for the prospect of full lockdown again.
I just think that, lots of people are going to struggle with it, mental health and financially, we
need to get a grip of this, so if that's what needs to happen, I'm all for it.
Is it really necessary? Do we really need to go into another national lockdown? Is it good for the economy? Do we really need to put everything on hold all over again?
Ishfaq runs 6 restaurants, which have already lost around 30% of business under Tier 2, which banned households from mixing indoors.
We've lost a lot of business. Now, if we go for another lockdown, it's just going to really cripple the business and, everyone.
Months of restrictions have left some businesses here hanging by a thread, unsure if they can survive a winter of tougher lockdown. Lakshmi Gopal, BBC News, Bradford.
Let's have a reminder now what restrictions are in place around the UK. In Wales, the 17-day firebreak lockdown, with people only able to leave their homes for limited reasons, continues. It's currently set to finish on November the 9th. Northern Ireland's First Minister Arlene Foster has said that the current tightened restrictions there will end as planned on the 13th of November. Pubs and restaurants have been closed, and schools, which will reopen on Monday, were closed for 2 weeks. Scotland's First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, has urged against all non-essential travel across the border with England. A new 5-level system of restrictions for tackling coronavirus will come into force in Scotland on Monday, which will see travel restrictions imposed on many Scots. Now, the James Bond star, Sir Sean Connery, has died at the age of 90. The first screen actor to play 007, it was a role that brought him global stardom and was followed by decades as one of Hollywood's leading actors. Our arts editor, Will Gompertz, looks back at his life.
Sean Connery was the first, and for many, the preeminent
Bond. James Bond.
With the inner snarl of Humphrey Bogart and the outward charm of Cary Grant, Connery created a charismatic screen legend, a ladies' man.
Looking for shells?
No, I'm just looking.
With a killer's instinct. He went from being a jobbing actor in his early 30s to an international movie star, an instantly recognisable global celebrity. The attention and fuss that came with the fame did not sit comfortably with the no-nonsense working-class Scot, who'd once been a milkman, a model, and briefly, a coffin buffer.
I had no awareness of
that scale of kind of reverence and pressure and what have you. I never had a press representative or anything, and I found it a bit of a nightmare.
Bond was universally popular, but not with the man playing him. Connery felt trapped in 007's gilded cage. He wanted out, to test his talents with more challenging roles. He won plaudits for the man who would be king, playing alongside his old friend Michael Caine.
We've been all over India. We know her cities, her jungles, her jails and her palaces. And we have decided that she isn't big enough for such as we.
He won an Oscar for The Untouchables.
Want to get Capone? Here's how you get him. He pulls a knife, you pull a gun. He sends one of yours to the hospital, you send one of his to the morgue. That's the Chicago way.
I suddenly remembered my Charlemagne. Let my armies be the rocks and the trees and the birds in the sky.
And won legions more fans in Indiana Jones. He was a proud Scot and a committed member of the SNP.
Came from humble beginnings, but through charisma, talent, sheer hard work, became one of the world's greatest actors. And, you know, his achievements are absolutely legendary. And I know that across Scotland today, we are mourning one of our best loved sons.
Tell me, Miss Strange, do you play any other games?
He will always be remembered for playing 007. But James Bond didn't make Sean Connery. Sean Connery made James Bond.
My name is Pussy Galore.
I must be dreaming.
A movie icon established by an intelligent, versatile, exceptionally talented actor.
Sir Sean Connery, who's died aged 90. And we'll be back on BBC One with the full Downing Street news conference after the news where you are. But for now, goodbye.
Hello there. It's remaining very windy for the rest of today. Widespread gales with severe gales likely across Northern Ireland and Western Scotland. Some heavy rain continuing across Scotland and Northern Ireland. So the combination of rain and gales both today and tomorrow is likely to cause some issues and risk of minor flooding for some western hills. So some disruption is likely. Stay tuned to the weather forecast and head online to check out all the latest weather warnings. Now, this is Storm Aidan, which was named by the Irish Met Service, is likely to bring a spell of very severe winds to Northern Ireland and into Western Scotland for the rest of today. Some heavy rain continuing here as well. Further south, after that rain clears, it will be brighter briefly. Just one or two blustery showers around, but it'll stay very windy. Those winds 40, 50 miles an hour, maybe more in exposure, and stronger than that around Irish Sea coast, 70 to 80 miles an hour across Western Scotland and Northern Ireland for a time. By the end of the day, it's still going to be fairly mild, although it's not going to feel like it, of course, because of the strength of the wind, and certainly where we have the rain in the northwest. Now that rain begins to peter out overnight, becomes more showery, and then skies clear. In fact, many areas will be dry for a time overnight before the next low pressure system hurtles in off the Atlantic to bring strengthening winds and outbreaks of pretty heavy and persistent rain. Those temperatures will be rising again across the south, generally into double figures by around dawn. So our new area of low pressure, which contains the remnants of what was Hurricane Zeta, is going to bring another very wet and windy day to most areas, but it's again Western Scotland closer to that area of low, which is going to see the strongest of the winds later on Sunday. So we lose the early morning rain. It brightens up for a little bit, but then more rain starts to pile into parts of Northern Ireland, northern western parts of England and Wales, and we could see some minor flooding as rainfall totals here really start to mount up through the course of the day. Another very windy day, not quite as windy as this afternoon, but it will be extremely windy for Western Scotland. Severe gales likely there. Something a bit cooler as well in the north, 10, 11 degrees here, but again for the Midlands southwards, it's going to be very mild. As we head on into next week, Monday also looks quite windy with further rain at times. Starts to turn a bit cooler and a bit more settled as we reach Tuesday, and those winds will begin to ease down. That's because high pressure will build in, and for the rest of next week, it looks drier with some sunshine around. It'll be less windy, but it will be colder both by day and by night.
Hello, you're watching BBC News with me, Rita Chakrabarti. The Prime Minister is due to announce new lockdown measures in England, with the new restrictions expected to last for a month. Non-essential retail and hospitality will be forced to close. Supermarkets will stay open. Households will not be allowed to mix inside unless for childcare reasons. Schools and universities will be allowed to stay open. Well, earlier I spoke to Professor Neil Ferguson, an epidemiologist at Imperial College London, who in March predicted that up to 500,000 Britons could die from COVID-19, which led to the government enforcing a nationwide lockdown. He gave me his reaction to a new lockdown for England.
Modelling also at that time suggested that we might have to go into lockdown more than once, that if we relaxed measures that transmission would resurge. And unfortunately that's what we've seen this autumn, with schools reopening, with shops reopening. And whilst the tier 3, tier 2 measures are having some effect at slowing spread, it doesn't seem to be enough. And therefore, if we want to get what are now very high infection levels down, we need to impose more measures, particularly ahead of Christmas.
So should this have been done earlier? Because we know that the Scientific Advisory Group was talking from September the 21st about locking down earlier.
I think it's a difficult set of questions because there is an economic impact to all of these measures, and businesses are already suffering. I think there was a justifiable reason to wait a little to see whether the tiered measures being introduced would have sufficient effect to control infection levels. It doesn't appear to be the case that that's the effect, that whilst they're slowing infection, they're not causing case numbers to drop, which is what we really need at the moment.
So you think it was understandable and justifiable for the government to try the tiered, localised measures first?
I understand the political reasons for doing so. I mean, we are epidemiologists. We study disease trends. We suggest things which might bring infection levels down. But at the end of the day, there's a balancing act between introducing measures which we think will work effectively, but at huge cost, and balancing the impacts on the economy.
So we learnt yesterday that on October the 8th, the Scientific Advisory Group was saying that the projection now exceeded their worst case scenario. So that was 3 weeks ago. Should the government have acted sooner?
I think there have been a lot of discussions in government, and obviously we've seen areas being escalated. And of course, we're only talking about back in 2-3 weeks ago with the introduction of the tiered system, which it would the government hoped would bring infections under control. I mean, there was always some question as to whether tier 3 measures were sufficient in those hotspot areas to slow in and to reverse infection levels. That has proved not to be the case.
I don't know if it's possible for you to answer this, but can you quantify what difference it would have made if a lockdown had been brought in earlier?
We can quantify, yes, but I think there's an important consideration here that all a lockdown does is reduce infection levels for the period of time it's in force. So if we think about where we're going to end up on Christmas Eve, whether we have a lockdown on, let's say, beginning of October or the beginning of November, and it only lasts for a month, you actually end up back in the same place as you would have done in that end of December time frame. I mean, lockdowns are effective when they're in force. They reverse infections by a certain amount, but then once you release them, infection levels we predict start going up again. So I think the really important question is what's going to follow this lockdown? What set of measures are we going to put in place which allow some more economic activity but don't allow virus levels to spike as we approach Christmas?
And that was Professor Neil Ferguson, who I spoke to a little bit earlier. Let's take a look now at the measures in place in the devolved nations in the UK. Wales's First Minister, Mark Drakeford, said the firebreak there will end as planned and that his cabinet will meet on Sunday to discuss any potential border issues for Wales in light of any announcement by Number 10. Scotland's new tiered system of restrictions will come into force on Monday. First Minister Nicola Sturgeon has issued new advice for people not to travel to or from England. Welcome back now to viewers on BBC One. The Prime Minister is due to announce new lockdown measures in England, with the new restrictions expected to last for a month. Let's take a look now at what we know so far. Non-essential retail and hospitality will be forced to close. Supermarkets will stay open. Households will not be allowed to mix inside unless for childcare reasons. Schools and universities will be allowed to stay open. Well, our political correspondent Chris Mason is here with me now. We can see, Chris, viewers can see the door of Downing Street just now, and we are, of course, keeping an eye on what's going on inside. And we are expecting this very delayed press conference to take place fairly soon.
Yes.
Talk us through what has happened this afternoon.
Well, not a lot is the short answer in terms of what's happened publicly. A huge amount has been happening privately. So if you turned on a few hours ago and you heard me saying that the press conference was imminent, well, it was at the time. The word imminent should always be treated rather elastically when it comes to government announcements and the timing of them at the moment, not least because clearly there are big decisions being taken and things are very fluid and things have moved very quickly today. So we were originally expecting this news conference at 4 o'clock, then at 5 o'clock, then at around about 6:30, which is, yes, now. We think it will happen within the next 15 minutes. So we will hear from the Prime Minister, we'll hear from Chris Whitty, England's Chief Medical Officer, the Government's Chief Medical Advisor, and also from Sir Patrick Vallance, who is the Government's Chief Scientific Advisor. So the trio that we have heard from on all of the big occasions during this pandemic, reappearing publicly together in this news conference. As you say, we are expecting an England-wide lockdown to be announced starting on Thursday, running until the 2nd of December, with non-essential shops being closed, not including supermarkets. Supermarkets will remain open. The hospitality sector closing down with the exception of takeaways, so pubs, cafes and restaurants closing. People being able to meet one person outside from beyond their household. So an important detail there, particularly for those who live alone. And then crucially, the distinction you were reporting there that is different from what happened across the UK in the spring is that schools, colleges and universities will stay open. What we've seen today, and one of the explanations behind this delay in the news conference, is the government being caught something on the hop by reports late last night and in the newspapers this morning and on the BBC that this is what the government was considering privately. We know from a message that was sent by the Prime Minister to Conservative MPs this evening that this isn't the choreography that he had hoped for. He had hoped to be able to give a statement in the House of Commons on Monday, setting out what we expect to hear from him in the next 15 minutes or so, but given the journalism that was done by the newspapers and others managing to find out what was happening privately within government, they have had to bring that forward, because otherwise there would have been a weekend of speculation without us hearing from the Prime Minister. Hence, a rapidly assembled cabinet meeting that happened at around about 1:30 this afternoon. I understand that did involve scientists as well, briefing cabinet ministers. In addition to that, opposition party leaders were then briefed as well, because there'll be a vote in the Commons in the coming days. And then obviously there's been the process of assembling this news conference and the series of delays that have seen it being pushed back once or twice. Normally we wouldn't, I guess, talk in great detail about the process around which these events take place, but given that if you've been watching us for the last couple of hours, you'll have seen that there's been the delays. It's kind of important, I guess, to try and offer some sort of explanation as to why that is happening. Clearly, in the government's defence, they are handling something entirely unprecedented in its scale and its scope, and that is, I guess, part of the reason for the delays. Politically, as we were hearing from Laura Kuenssberg earlier, Labour have been making the argument for several weeks that this kind of thing should happen, some sort of lockdown. The Prime Minister, in just the last few days, was arguing the opposite, that the regional approach was the best strategy. Clearly, there is a reluctance from the government to have to press this most extreme of buttons, but confronted by the data, they've been left with no other option.
So we do hope to hear from the Prime Minister in the next few minutes. But surely one of the questions that he is going to be asked is really what has changed, because the warnings from his own scientific advisory group have been going on since late September.
Yeah. So the SAGE group of scientists, they advised the government, they warned back on September the 21st that in their view, given the modelling that they were doing and the data that they had, that a circuit breaker lockdown, as they described it, was wise, potentially around the half-term holiday period, which is just coming to an end in most parts of England, because you would be able to shut everything down and also close schools without actually having an impact on education, because the schools would have been closed anyway. The government was reluctant to do that, and of course they have a very difficult balancing act, trying to maintain people's livelihoods, businesses, the economy, and also our liberties, which have been hugely constrained in the last 6 months, as well as trying to repress the virus. And the argument was, what are you going to achieve in terms of reducing coronavirus cases in Manchester, for instance, by locking down Cornwall? However, in the last couple of days, a couple of key bits of data emerging and been shown to the Prime Minister and the senior cabinet ministers. One was a series of projections from a range of scientists, all of which pointed to a far more imminent peak of the virus and a far higher peak than even the reasonable worst-case scenario that had been the basis for the government arriving at its decisions up until now. And then in addition to that, modelling that had been done by NHS England suggesting that the capacity in our hospitals around England could very quickly be exceeded, even in those areas where the current caseload might be rising but is still relatively low. Confronted by those two sets of data, the Prime Minister was clearly, in his view, left with no option but to act.
Chris, once again, many thanks. Chris Mason there, our political correspondent. Now, earlier we were joined by the Chair of Global Public Health at the University of Edinburgh, Devi Sridhar, and she said a national lockdown in England is inevitable.
In the position England's in, it seems inevitable. They have to slow it down. And unfortunately, nobody wants a lockdown, but it seems like there's no other choice right now, because uncontrolled spread would be even worse.
Is this action that you think the government should have taken earlier?
Yes, well, I actually go back to the summer and I say we had a lockdown. We've been in some kind of, restrictions since March. We got numbers pretty low in June. What did we do wrong in June, which means we're not in a better position now? And for me, there are three things that East Asian countries have done. Many of them never even locked down, which was first, strict border restrictions. You don't keep re-importing chains of infection. Second, voluntary good guidance to the public on avoiding the virus at all ages. You don't want to get this even if you're young. And third, a test, trace, isolate system, which works well for flare-ups and at low numbers. But just relying on, a lockdown is probably the harshest and crudest way to deal with a virus like this. And I don't think it's sustainable for the next few months to be in the lockdown and release cycle. It would be a pretty rubbish path to go down.
But then what is the alternative? Which countries have managed this better? Because we look across the channel to France, we look at Italy and Spain, they're all having a very rough time of it too.
Yeah, so the countries that are doing the best at this are in East Asia: Taiwan, South Korea, Thailand, Vietnam, Hong Kong, Singapore. And interestingly, New Zealand, Australia, which first looked to the European model, decided they didn't want to follow the flu pandemic model and then pivoted to the East Asian SARS model, which is eliminating the virus. And this is feasible. We saw in the summer that with the right restrictions, you can get numbers low, and then as cases come in, catch them at airports, deal with flare-ups at a localized level. But as long as we try to live alongside this virus, we will have restrictions on our daily life because it is so infectious that it takes off growth very quickly. And secondly, because of rising hospitalizations, that health services are forced to react and forced to actually slow things down. The choice is not between COVID and non-COVID harm. The choice is, do you want a lot of COVID and non-COVID harm, or do you want minimal COVID harm and minimal non-COVID harm? That's the real choices for countries right now, given what we've seen over the past year.
So how do you see England within the UK, for example? Because England is, in a sense, the last to impose a strict set of rules. Scotland, of course, is not in national lockdown, but it does have this 5-tier system.
Yeah, so England currently you could see is the outlier in the UK. You see that Wales is a firebreaker. You've talked about Northern Ireland and Scotland, and the idea was to move early, to move sharp, to use the half-term break when schools were off to get numbers low. And then the question is, once they're low, how do you keep them there while you try to get back some normality and get the economy going? And that's where their border restrictions become important. And this is something, coming back to European countries, that European countries have been loath to do. They have not wanted to stop the movement in and out of their borders. And it's also also why islands have done so well. You know, to be an island in 2020 has been a gift because you can actually then control and prevent and catch infections at ports of entry, at airports. If you have a land border like Germany, I know they've considered this, you have land borders with 9 countries. How exactly do you stop traffic across those, especially when you're part of the EU? It has to be a joint-up strategy. So I think the integration of Europe and the movement has actually created a lot of kind of cross-contamination and no real joined-up strategy so that we all kind of deal with this in a similar approach and on a similar timeline.
Professor Devi Sridhar there, who I spoke to a little bit earlier. Now, Professor Sunetra Gupta is an infectious disease epidemiologist from the University of Oxford and joins us now. Good evening to you, Professor Gupta. So we are heading for a month-long national lockdown in England. How do you view that?
Well, I think it's most unfortunate. I think that this is not a long-term solution to this problem. As Neil Ferguson said, you know, all this does is delay the inevitable growth in infections. So I don't see this as a long-term strategy, and I think it's going to cause enormous harm, particularly to those who are disadvantaged. And I hope schools don't close. I hope universities stay open. And but if they don't, then we'll be also causing a lot of harm to those we should be most obliged to protect.
Well, what is the alternative, given the data that we've seen? Fears that the NHS might be overwhelmed.
So I wish we hadn't got to that position at all. I think if we had protected the vulnerable, if we, right at the outset, as soon as we saw cases or infections rising, then we should have been able to prevent a situation whereby the NHS was being overwhelmed. If we had this summer invested more in creating capacity within the NHS for the number of infections, cases, clinical cases that are perhaps inevitable, then we would have been in a different position. And I think that is what we should continue to focus on, the protection of the vulnerable. As it is, we're going into a lockdown which is going to put in place some of those very measures that are necessary to protect the vulnerable, against which many people have been arguing. And at the same time, we're now going to penalise the rest of the population in a very, very tough way.
It's difficult, isn't it? Because the point was being made earlier in the afternoon that there has been increased capacity in the NHS, the huge Nightingale hospitals that have been built. But the problem is staffing rather than just capacity.
Well, I think surely there must be some ways of dealing with this. I mean, if we hadn't underfunded the NHS the last 30 years, we wouldn't be in this position. I'm certain, I mean, the other countries, as many people have pointed out, have done better. And the reason they've done better is because they have better funded national health systems and because they have better funded and more thoughtfully structured care home systems. So it's because of the lack of these social systems and lack of funding, especially at the level of the local councils, that we are in this mess now. And I think the way out of it is still to focus on protecting those who are vulnerable in these areas and let population level immunity build up so that we attain an endemic equilibrium level as we enjoy right now with the other seasonal coronaviruses, 4 seasonal coronaviruses that are circulating.
And sorry to butt in, Professor Gupta. I just wonder, when you talk about protecting the vulnerable, are you talking about a return to shielding?
Yes, I should think so, over a short period of time. So between now and Christmas, since Christmas seems to be the goal, that we should enter into a system where we have shielding if we see the cases continuing to rise. Meantime, we are, in any case, through lockdown, it is going to be the situation that grandparents won't get to see their grandchildren. And what we want to do is approach that equilibrium, endemic equilibrium, as swiftly as possible with the least harm done by way of virus deaths, so that we can go back to normal. And we have to, at all times, remember that the costs of lockdown are profound. This is not about false binaries. It's not a false binary when you're sitting in a small flat and facing a job loss and thinking about how you're going to feed your children. That's not a false binary.
OK. Very good to talk to you. Thank you so much. That's Professor Sunetra Gupta there from the University of Oxford. Thank you. Now, the Prime Minister is due to announce new lockdown measures in England. We are waiting for that news briefing from Downing Street. The new restrictions are expected to last for a month. Let's take a look at what we know so far. Non-essential retail and hospitality will be forced to close. Supermarkets will stay open. Households will not be allowed to mix inside unless for childcare reasons. Schools and universities will be allowed to stay open. Well, our political correspondent Chris Mason is back here with me. And Chris, I wonder if I could just start by, talking about that last point, that schools and universities will stay open. There's been a tweet from the Children's Commissioner for England, Anne Longfield, who says suggestions that schools will stay open during a forthcoming lockdown are very welcome. We've also always said that schools should be the last to shut and the first to open. It would be a disaster for children's well-being and education if they were to close. And it does sound as if Downing Street has heard that message and, in fact, schools will be open.
Yeah, and I think it's quite striking, Rita, that throughout the summer and then as we headed into the autumn and we were getting a sense that the cases were getting higher and the picture was looking bleaker, the consistent message publicly and privately from those in government as far as schools and educational settings in England was concerned, that even in the most grim scenario where a lockdown was coming, as we now know it is, that keeping schools open was absolutely essential. But we know from our programme that there is a live debate amongst teachers as to whether that is a good idea. You were talking to Kevin Courtney, weren't you, of the National Education Union a little earlier, who was making the argument that that shouldn't happen. So a contrast between his views and those expressed there by Anne Longfield, the Children's Commissioner for England, because that is the big distinction between the lockdown that we had across the UK in the spring and the one that we expect the Prime Minister to announce in the next few minutes for the next month. Because whilst non-essential shops will close, with supermarkets remaining open, hospitality closing except for takeaways, schools, colleges and universities will stay open. And so for children at least, their next month perhaps not as disjointed and disrupted as it will be for many others, and crucially their education not disrupted.
I wonder, Chris, while we wait for the Prime Minister to come out into the briefing room, for viewers who are wondering how we've got to this position whereby we are about to hear the Prime Minister announce a national lockdown in England, whereas just a few days ago he was insisting that a localised tiered system was the way forward. How has that change happened?
Yeah, not only has been this very rapid change, but then there's been this choreography or lack of it this afternoon, where here we are at 7:15 talking about this imminent press briefing when a viewer might have turned on for a reality show involving Little Mix, and instead they have you and me talking about a news conference that hasn't yet happened. It is that the data has changed very quickly, and then news management, the way the government had hoped to communicate this, has been overtaken by journalists managing to establish what was being discussed privately. That is the job of journalists, and bringing that to readers and viewers of newspapers and websites and radio and television rather sooner than the Prime Minister had anticipated. So, on the data, in the last couple of days, the Prime Minister, the Chancellor and others presented with two key pieces of data. One was from a series of scientific models that the projections that those models were making, yes, they have big margins of error, but all of them were pointing to a far sooner spike and a far higher spike in the number of deaths happening per day in the next month or so, if nothing was to change as far as restrictions were concerned, than even the reasonable worst case scenario that was the basis for the government's outlook up until now. And in addition to that, some modelling done by NHS England looking at hospital capacity suggested that across England, even in those areas where the caseload is currently relatively low, there was the prospect of hospital capacity being exceeded. I think what we can expect in this news conference that is imminent, we hope, involving the Prime Minister, Professor Chris Whitty, England's Chief Medical Officer, Patrick Vallance, the Government's Chief Scientific Advisor, is the next slide, please, moments. We're going to get lots of these data slides. Yes, they will show that the regional picture around England is variable, but they will also show how it is increasing substantially everywhere. And I suspect the point will be made that unless action is taken pretty imminently, there would have been a huge threat in terms of the NHS's capacity being overcome. The Prime Minister, we know, did not want to have to reach this moment. He was a keen advocate and a passionate advocate of the regional tiered approach. And with that took quite a lot of political heat. You'll remember the conversations, the arguments, the very public, angry arguments.
I'm going to stop you, Chris. Here they are.
Good evening, and apologies for disturbing your Saturday evening with more news of COVID, and I can assure you I wouldn't do this unless it was absolutely necessary. But first I'm going to hand over to Chris and then to Patrick, who will present the latest data.
Thank you, Prime Minister. First slide, please. This is a version of a slide that listeners and watchers may have seen several times before. But as you can see, the weekly case rate for COVID, which is in the darker colours, mean that the numbers are worse, is spreading steadily. It was quite heavily concentrated in particular areas, and it is now over quite a large part of the country on the left. And on the right, you can see the rate of change. Anything in brown or yellow, the rate is increasing. The darker the colour, the more rapid the rate of increase. And again, across virtually the entire country now, there is a significant rate of increase. Next slide, please. The thing which correlates most with future NHS capacity and NHS activity from COVID is the spread in people over the age of 60. Although people younger than that can certainly get severe COVID, and some of them may need hospitalisation and indeed intensive care, the majority of the disease that causes really severe disease is in that age group. And as you can see, that's a smaller area, but again, that has widened very considerably and is going up across the country. Next slide, please. Data from the ONS, the Office for National Statistics, which is the official data, which is done as a survey across the country, shows that the prevalence of this disease has been going up extremely rapidly over the last few weeks, having been very flat due to the work of everybody in the country over spring and summer. And we now have around 50,000 new cases a day, and that is rising. Next slide, please. If we look around the country, thanks to the work that everyone is still doing, the R is substantially lower than it would have been if people were not doing the social distancing, were not doing all the things in families, in firms around the country. It would be going up much more rapidly than it is at the moment. But there is an increase in virtually every part of the country, apart possibly from the North East, where they have been taking additional measures, substantial additional measures, and there is some evidence of some flattening, but not yet of any evidence of the coronavirus falling. And that is important because it is now at quite a high level, and if things went wrong, the margin of error is very, very small. We have very little headroom, even in the one area where there is some flattening at the moment. So things are going up across the whole country. Next slide, please. And it's probably important to think about this in terms of ages. These heat maps go from left to right over time, so the right is the most recent, and from bottom, which is children under the age of 16, up to top, which is people over 60. And as you can see, what happens in every area is that it gets darker, meaning there's more cases all the way through the period we're looking at, and it steadily moves up the ages. So it doesn't remain constrained just to one age group. And the top line is beginning to darken in every part of the country. And those are the people over 60 who, as I say, will translate over time into some cases going into the NHS. Next slide, please. And we're now beginning to see this. This is moving over to NHS activity. We're beginning to see this with a rise in the number of hospital admissions in England by age group. And this is just looking at people at different age groups. There is a rise in virtually every age group in older adults. Basically, anyone over the age of 45, there's a rise in number of people going into hospital with COVID over time. And this is obviously going up, not in a straight line, but in an accelerating line. Next slide, please. If we compare the number of people in hospital at this moment with the first peak of COVID, these are NHS people in NHS beds in England by NHS region. Currently, only in the northwest is this coming close to the peak that we previously had, but it is increasing in every area. And if we do nothing, the inevitable result is that these numbers will go up and they will eventually exceed the peak that we saw in spring of this year. Next slide, please. And therefore, if you look at the NHS as a whole, inpatient beds, dark blue is August, light blue is September, and purple is October. You can see it was still falling in August. In September, initially flat, and then a very gradual increase in numbers, but now it is going up steadily on an exponential curve. Next slide, please. Looking at individual hospitals, NHS hospitals, these are the hospitals with more than 100 COVID inpatients in them. This number will increase over the next weeks. And in green are hospitals which have got below half of their previous peak. In orange is the point where they actually get to half the number of people in hospital they had at the COVID peak, and in red is where they exceed the number of hospital inpatients they had at the peak of the first wave of this. And as you can see, the progression is steady, and we now have several hospitals with more inpatients with COVID than we had during the peak in spring. Next slide, please. Fortunately, the death rate, although rising, is still significantly below the peak, but the mortalities rate, the death rate, will track the number of people going into the NHS over time with a significant delay. And we're seeing increases now that are quite noticeable in the North West, Yorkshire and Humber, and the North East, and increasingly in the Midlands as well. But the other areas will follow because they will follow the NHS admissions. So that's all the data in terms of looking backwards. Those have already happened. Patrick is now going to talk briefly about the projections forwards.
Thank you. Can I have the first slide, please? So just to recap, at the moment, these are three different ways of looking at it from different studies or the consensus group from the modellers of the number of people every day with COVID, catching COVID new, and it's 50,000 plus most likely as the number, and perhaps 500,000 people or more overall with the disease. Next slide, please. The R was relatively flat and below 1. Below the red line means the epidemic is shrinking, above the red line means it's growing. And you can see from August onwards, the R went above 1, the epidemic grew and continues to grow. So although some of the measures that are in place have eased off perhaps the rate of growth, it's still growing. And that growth from a high baseline means numbers get very big quite quickly. Because of this continued R above 1, the modelling group asked a number of academic groups to create scenarios as to what might happen on assumptions that R stays above 1 and goes between 1.3, 1.5 and possibly up over the course of the winter. And the next slide shows the early working from 2 weeks ago of some of those groups looking at deaths in England over the winter period. So this is early work scenarios looking at this on the assumptions of R. Different groups, and as you can see, different groups come up with different answers depending on their models. But what is clear from all of them, in terms of deaths over the winter, there's the potential for this to be twice as bad or more in terms of the first wave compared to the first wave. So the models are clearly showing that this could be the case in these scenarios that are presented here. I want to move, though, from scenarios to now looking at the 6-week projections, which are more based on data now and have greater certainty than you can ever get when you're looking months ahead. This shows the hospital daily admissions. You can see the first peak on the left-hand side, and then over to the right-hand side, you come up to date, today, and then the projections forward over the next 6 weeks. And this is a consensus view across a number of modelling groups. And what you can see here is a projection that over the next 6 weeks into early December, the numbers exceed the numbers of hospitalisations in the first wave peak. And as Chris has already said, in some hospitals you see that already, but this suggests across the country as a whole we would see this. Some hospitals earlier than others, some a bit later, but this is the projection in terms of hospital admissions over the next 6 weeks, with the uncertainties in the shaded blue area. Next slide, please. Inevitably, hospitalisations lead, unfortunately, to deaths in some people. Again, you can see the first wave on the left-hand side, and the dotted line indicates the top of the first wave. And on the right-hand side, you can see the projection from today going forward in the blue. And again, the light blue indicates the uncertainty range. But what you can see is the model suggests increasing, the models, this is a consensus across models, suggest increasing deaths over the next 6 weeks, so that by the beginning of December, the 8th of December, this is very close to the first wave peak, if nothing is done. Now, clearly, if you stop the R from increasing, if you allow the R to come down, then you would flatten this off and then potentially reverse it. But on the current trajectory, that is what is thought to be the prediction for deaths over the next 6 weeks. And of course, that would continue to go up because the hospitalisations already exceeded the first wave peak. By this time, deaths would follow. So unfortunately, that's a very grim picture in terms of what this looks like in the absence of action and continued growth. Next slide, please. This is a complicated slide. It's from the NHS and it shows what the impact of this would be on NHS beds. So on the left-hand side is acute hospital beds, and on the right-hand side is ventilator beds. It's the same curve you've just seen, so the first peak on the left and then the projection on the right. So the projections that I've just shown you lead, when the NHS do their bed calculations, as peak usage being exceeded on the 20th of November. That's obviously not a precise estimate, but where this would fall on average. That the extra available beds would then be exceeded a couple of days later, 3 days later, and then extra capacity caused by having to postpone, unfortunately, all the things that nobody wants to postpone gets exceeded sometime later in December. And a similar picture is seen on ventilator beds, where the peak gets reached at the towards the end of November or in December, and the currently available get breached a little bit earlier. So this is a picture of what the NHS pressures would look like under the scenarios that are in the 6-week projection. I will hand back to you, Prime Minister.
Oh, thank you very much, Patrick, and thanks, Chris. Look, I'm afraid no responsible Prime Minister can ignore the message of those figures. And when I told you 2 weeks ago that we were pursuing a local and a regional approach to tackling this virus, I believed then, and I still believe passionately, that was the right thing to do, because we know the cost of these restrictions, the damage they do, the impact on jobs and on livelihoods and on people's mental health. And no one wants to be imposing these kinds of measures anywhere. And we didn't want to be shutting businesses, pubs, restaurants in one part of the country where incidence was very low, when the vast bulk of the infections were taking place elsewhere. And our hope was that by strong local action, strong local leadership, we could get the rates of infection down where the disease was surging and address the problem thereby across the whole country. I want to thank the millions of people who've been putting up with these restrictions in their areas for so long. I want to thank the local leaders who've stepped up, and local communities, because as you can see from some of those charts, that the R has been kept lower than it would otherwise have been, and there are signs that your work has been paying off, and we will continue as far as we possibly can to adopt a pragmatic and a local approach in the months ahead. But as we've also seen from those charts, we've got to be humble in the face of nature. And in this country, alas, as across much of Europe, the virus is spreading even faster than the reasonable worst-case scenario of our scientific advisors, whose models, as you've just seen, now suggest that unless we act, we could see deaths in this country running at several thousand a day, a peak of mortality, alas, bigger than the one we saw in April. And as you've just seen, even in the southwest, where incidence was so low and still is so low, it's now clear, though, that the current projections mean that hospitals in the southwest will run out of capacity in just a matter of weeks unless we act. And let me explain why the overrunning of the NHS would be a medical and a moral disaster beyond the raw loss of life. Because the huge exponential growth in the number of patients, by no means all of them elderly, by the way, would mean that doctors and nurses would be forced to choose which patients to treat, who would get oxygen and who wouldn't, who would live and who would die. And doctors and nurses would be forced to choose between saving COVID patients and non-COVID patients, and the sheer weight of COVID demand would mean depriving tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of non-COVID patients of the care they need. And it's crucial to grasp this, that the general threat to public health comes not from focusing too much on COVID, but from not focusing enough, from failing to get it under control. And if we let the lines on those graphs grow in the way that they could and the way that they're projected to grow, then the risk is that for the first time in our lives, the NHS will not be there for us and for our families. And even if I could now double capacity overnight, and obviously I'm proud that we have massively increased capacity. We do have the Nightingales. We've got 13,000 more nurses now than we had last year. We've got many more doctors. But it still would not be enough, because the virus is doubling faster than we can conceivably add capacity. And so now is the time to take action, because there is no alternative. And from Thursday until the start of December, you must stay at home. You may only leave home for specific reasons, including for education, for work, let's say if you cannot work from home, for exercise and recreation outdoors with your household or on your own with one person from another household, for medical reasons, appointments, and to escape injury or harm, to shop for food and essentials, and to provide care for vulnerable people or as a volunteer. I'm afraid non-essential shops, leisure and entertainment venues will all be closed, though click and collect services can continue and essential shops will remain open, so there's no need to stock up. Pubs, bars, and restaurants must close except for takeaway and delivery services. Workplaces should stay open where people can't work from home, for example, in the construction and manufacturing sectors. Single adult households can still form exclusive support bubbles with one other household, and children will still be able to move between homes if their parents are separated. If you're clinically vulnerable or over the age of 60, you should be especially careful to follow the rules and minimise your contacts with others. I know how tough shielding was, and we will not ask people to shield again in the same way, but we are asking those who are clinically extremely vulnerable to minimise their contact with others and not to go to work if they are unable to work from home. I'm under no illusions about how difficult this will be for businesses which have already had to endure such hardship this year, and I'm truly, truly sorry for that. And that's why we're going to extend the furlough system through November. The furlough scheme was a success in the spring. It supported people and businesses in a critical time. We will not end it. We will extend furlough until December. There will be some differences compared to March. These measures, above all, will be time limited. Starting Thursday, the 5th of November, they'll end on Wednesday, the 2nd of December, when we'll seek to ease restrictions, going back into the tiered system on a local and a regional basis, according to the latest data and trends. Christmas is going to be different this year, perhaps very different, but it's my sincere hope and belief that by taking tough action now, we can allow families across the country to be together. My priority, our priority, remains keeping people in education, so childcare, early years settings, schools, colleges and universities will all remain open. Our senior clinicians still advise that school is the best place for children to be. We cannot let this virus damage our children's futures even more than it has already, and I urge parents to continue taking their children to school, and I'm extremely grateful to teachers across the country for their dedication in enabling schools to remain open. And it's vital that we keep provision for non-healthcare groups going. So, please, and this is really important, unless your clinicians tell you otherwise, you should continue to use the NHS, get your scans, turn up for your appointments and pick up your treatments. If at all possible, we want you to continue to access these services now and through the winter. Indeed, it's only by taking this action that we can protect the NHS for you. On Monday, I'm going to set out our plans to Parliament. On Wednesday, Parliament will debate and vote on these measures, which, if passed, will, as I say, come into force on Thursday. We've updated the devolved administrations on the action we're taking in England and stand ready to work with them on plans for Christmas and beyond. We should remember that we're not alone in what we're going through. Our friends in Belgium, France, Germany have taken very similar action. And so, as we come together now to fight this second wave, I want to say something about the way ahead, because people will reasonably ask, when will this all end? And as I've said before, I am optimistic that this will feel very different and better by the spring. It's not just that we have ever better medicines and therapies and the realistic hope of a vaccine in the first quarter of next year. We now have the immediate prospect of using many millions of cheap, reliable and, above all, rapid turnaround tests. Tests that you can use yourself to tell you whether or not you're infectious and get the result within 10 to 15 minutes. And we know from trials across the country in schools and hospitals that we can use these tests not just to locate infectious people, but to drive down the disease. And so over the next few days, weeks, we plan a steady but massive expansion in the deployment of these quick turnaround tests, applying them in an ever-growing number of situations, from helping women to have their partners with them in labour wards when they're giving birth, to testing whole towns and even whole cities. The Army has been brought in to work on the logistics, and the programme will begin in a matter of days, working with local communities, local government, public health directors, organisations of all kinds, to help people discover whether or not they're infectious, and then immediately to get them, to help them to self-isolate and stop the spread of the disease. And I can tell you tonight that the scientists may be pretty uniformly gloomy about the immediate options that we face, but they are unanimously optimistic about the medium and the long-term future. We will get through this, but we must act now to contain this autumn surge. We're not going back to the full-scale lockdown of March and April. The measures that I've outlined are less prohibitive and less restrictive, but I'm afraid from Thursday the basic message is the same. Stay at home, protect the NHS and save lives.
Right, we're going to leave that press conference now for viewers on BBC One, but coverage of this news conference continues on the BBC News channel. And we'll return to that news briefing going on.
Solidarity with the rest of the UK.
Well, thanks very much, Matt. Look, it's not solidarity with the rest of the UK, alas. It's not a gesture. What we're seeing, the numbers from the southwest, it's very clear that it's doubling there as well, and the pressure on the hospitals in the southwest is particularly acute, and we've got to recognise that although the incidence is low, it is growing in the southwest, and we need to tackle it, and we need to tackle it now. But Chris and Patrick, anything you want to add to that?
The only thing to add, Prime Minister, is just to reiterate, many of the areas which are lower have some of the highest rates of increase, and also some areas, including the southwest, are likely to get pressure on beds really relatively early because of the particular way that the NHS is constructed in those areas.
Thanks very much, Matt. Let's go to Alex from London. Alex from London asks, many graduates of 2020 are struggling to find work and having their internships and placements cancelled. What is the government doing to support graduates in accessing the labour market? Well, thanks, Alex. One of the many things that we're doing is the £2 billion Kickstart programme, which is designed to help 18 to 24-year-olds get into the labour market by supporting their employers to take them on with a contribution from government to the value of the living wage, and we hope that will be effective in what will unquestionably be tough months ahead. Kickstart amongst many other schemes that we're using to support young people get jobs across this country. I'm going to go now to, since that was obviously a question for me rather than for the scientists, I'm going to go to Laura Koonsberg of the BBC. Laura.
Thank you very much, and good evening, Prime Minister. You were told by your own scientists many weeks ago that you would have to take national action in order to save lives. Prime Minister, what took you so long? And to Professor Whitty and Sir Patrick, you've always been clear that taking early action would have the greatest chance of success in controlling the spread of this disease. Do you think that people may have lost their lives unnecessarily because of the delay?
Well, Laura, let me just answer your question by saying this is a constant struggle and a balance that any government has to make between lives and livelihoods, and obviously lives must come first, but we have to be mindful the whole time of the scarring, the long-term economic